Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. For the majority of us, the economy boils down to two simple concerns, employment and jobs. Which is why when 120 million people lost jobs at the start of the lockdown, it was a nationwide crisis. So today, 4 days after the budget, we ask, how serious is the continuing employment problem and how effectively has it been tackled in the budget? Joining me today to answer that question is a gentleman that many consider India's foremost expert on employment, the CEO and Managing Director of the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, Mahesh Vyas. Dr. Vyas, let's start by establishing how serious is the problem of employment today. Your organization, CMIE, said that in December, when the finance minister was preparing the budget, employment had fallen by 14.7 million. Other surveys put it as high as 18 million. In January, your organization said that, in fact, employment had improved by 11.9 million. But if you compare January 2020 with January 2021, employment is still down by 9.8 million. So let me ask you, today as we speak, how serious is the employment problem?
I think the employment problem is very serious, and we should take it as a serious problem and not ignore it. You pointed out that the January numbers were an improvement, but I think we should be a little wary of looking at month on month and monthly changes, because these could be because of very localized factors which are not displaying the trend entirely. What I see is that the employment problem got serious after the lockdown, very serious after the lockdown, and has remained serious, although there has been a recovery. Let's take a few numbers into consideration. In 2016, according to the CMIE survey, employment in India was 407 million people were employed. This declined steadily year after year and came down to 403 million in 1920. And even in January, when there was an improvement, it was 400 million. Now, this is not a good sign. Population keeps rising. Young population that is entering the labor force looking for jobs is rising even faster. So we should never, ever be seeing a decline in employment, even if it is too small, 11 million, 3 million, 5 million, whatever it is. A decline should be unacceptable. What we are seeing is that there is a decline in employment, and that is the serious matter. Look at it from another angle. And that's the right way of looking at the employment problem, which is, what is the employment rate in India? The employment rate in India is the proportion of the people who are of working age, 15 years or more, and how much percent of them are employed. According to us, that number was 43% in 16, came down to 42%, then came down to 40%, 39%, and now we are at 38%. Every 1% fall is a large number of people not getting into the employed category. I think this fall in the employment rate is what we should really worry about a lot.
That's a very clear and important point you've made. Don't focus on the fact that the unemployment rate may have improved a bit between December and January, because, as you said, local factors could be somewhat distorting or changing the overall real picture. Look instead on the employment rate, which is the percentage of people of working age who have jobs. And that has fallen from 42% in 2016 to just 38% today. This means that actually the number of people of employable age who've got jobs is shrinking, and shrinking very sizably.
That's really worrisome. I mean, this fall in the proportion of working age population falling is our biggest problem.
Now, 24 or 48 hours after the budget came out, you wrote an article for the Business Standard, and this is what you said. The government of India does not recognize any employment problem in the country. The finance minister's speech contained no specific scheme to help the unemployed or to generate employment directly. In other words, you're saying there was nothing in the budget that will specifically address in a substantial way the problem of unemployment that we face.
That is right. That's what I observed in the finance minister's speech. I heard it through the entire speech and was waiting to hear at least some recognition of the problem. And then, once you recognize the problem, then you start addressing it. But if there is no recognition of the problem, if there is no acknowledgement of the problem that the employment rate in the country is falling or absolute employment numbers are falling, and the country is not generating enough good jobs, then we will not even address the issues. So right through, there are many schemes for infrastructure, for all kinds of things, but there is nothing to address, I think, one of the biggest problems of India, that jobs are shrinking, good jobs are shrinking even more, lesser and lesser proportion of the people who could have been harnessed to grow India's economy and improve the livelihoods of people is not happening. So this lack of acknowledgement, this lack of even a mention in both the budget speech as well as the economic survey is a bit troublesome.
In fact, when you say that there is no acknowledgement of what is one of the biggest problems in India, this is deliberate. It's not that she hasn't noticed it and therefore not acknowledged it, because she can't fail to be aware of the problem. She's deliberately chosen not to talk about it, not to acknowledge it.
Well, at least in the economic survey, I can see that there is a deliberate attempt not to acknowledge it. And I say that because the economic survey also a product of the finance ministry, and therefore the finance minister takes some responsibility for that. I see that there are two volumes in the economic survey. The first volume, they pick the subjects that are important and that are important for the long-term growth of the country or immediate problems. It's the choice of the chief economic advisor and the Ministry of Finance to pick that. In that first volume, there is no discussion regarding employment. And I underline, no discussion regarding employment. Zilch. That's disturbing. But let's take something more. Volume 2. Volume 2 has a chapter which has many things, including employment. Now, this is because Volume 2 is a more structured document. It takes all the subjects and has to deal with it. Volume 1, not talking about employment, is cherry-picking your problems and deciding not to talk about employment. That's an act of omission in a sense. Two, they are forced to speak of employment and unemployment, and they do use the PLFS data, the Periodic Labor Force Survey that the government of India does, and it discusses 18-19 over 17-18 and says that the employment situation in the country has improved. It will leave you with the impression that the country is doing quite well on the employment front, does not talk of 1920, because they will say we did not do the PLFS of 1920. Even there, when they look at the urban employment, they're saying there's an improvement. I think that's misleading. But worse, they do talk about 1920 EPFO data, and they say this was as of the data that they had as of December. But at the same time, they also had data regarding the most recent year where there's a fall in PF net enrollments, and they do not talk about it. So I think this is disturbing. Cherry picking what you would like to say and would not like to say. That's troublesome.
This is very important what you're saying. The economic survey is where, in a sense, the vision is contained for the economy as it rolls out, not just for the next year, but future years. In volume 1, there is no discussion of the employment problem whatsoever. Your word was zilch. In volume 2, they've cherry-picked what they've discussed. They've talked about employment in 2017-18 because they claim they have data for it, not the employment crisis that happened after the lockdown, when initially 120 million people lost their jobs. So the critical time which they should have spoken about, which is the lockdown, has been cherry-picked and ignored even in volume 2. Let's then at that point come to what the finance minister has been saying in interviews about how her budget, she claims, helps create jobs and therefore tackle the employment problem. She says that the scheme to promote textiles by developing mega investment parks will boost jobs. And secondly, she says the scheme to encourage infrastructure, particularly through roads and housing, will create jobs. Interestingly, in your Business Standard article, you discounted both. Of the textile scheme, you said it's unlikely to move the needle on employment much. And on the allocation for roads and housing, you said it's unlikely to make a material difference to employment. Why do you believe these two schemes, which she claims will boost employment, will do very little?
Well, when I read after hearing her, then I read the speech again to look again for employment and see where in the speech can I find instances that there will be employment growth. And when I go to the paragraph on textiles, what I read over there is that there are, I think I'm recalling from memory, there are 7 such industrial parks where textile industry will plug and play. The use of the term plug and play was more attractive in that paragraph than the number of people that will get employed. Also, this is over multiple years. When one talks of employment, one talks about clusters of employment, clusters of textile-based employment, like you have in Tirupur, for example, and many other places. So what is that vision regarding textile growth, which will create employment, is unclear from here. There are many ways in which it can be done, but saying that it will be a plug and play park is more like technology kind of thing. There's nothing wrong in that. Have a plug and play, but tell me how many people will get employed in this? What kind of people do you expect to come in over here? Similarly for infrastructure, we have always got infrastructure development, right? From Vajpayee days till now, every budget says infrastructure development will increase. Let's go back and look at this. How much infrastructure did we promise? How much got generated? How much employment got generated through that? So if one says there's going to be a lot of infrastructure investment, which will create employment, we require to at least get some math. If 100 million jobs are not lost, if 20 million jobs are lost, will we be able to recover those jobs in the next 1 year, 2 year, 3 year? Will we grow beyond that? That's the discussion on employment, not merely saying that we are doing this textiles, which will create employment. Everything creates employment. Even if you do a small little thing, you do add a few people, but that's not enough to generate employment.
It's the absence of real detail. It's the absence of focused commitment that leads you to conclude that what she's claiming will be employment created through textiles or employment created through roads and housing actually will be very little employment. And the important point you picked upon is that those 7 mega textile parks will actually be created over a 3-year period. There's a long gestation period ahead before they deliver jobs. And similarly, housing and roads also have a long gestation period, and they too will require 6-8 months before they provide jobs. Therefore, as you correctly say, there is little in the budget to immediately address the crisis that is at hand today. There is, however, a second way in which the government also can address employment, and it's the NREGA scheme. Now, you point out in your Business Standard article that, first of all, the finance minister didn't mention the word or the term NREGA in her budget speech at all. Secondly, when you look at the allocation for next year and compare RE to BE, the allocation for NREGA has actually been reduced by almost 35%. Now, that might make sense if rural unemployment is diminishing, but is it? Is rural unemployment diminishing to justify this 35% cut in NREGA?
So let's first give credit where it is due, that the budget estimate for NREGA scheme in 2019-20 was 615 billion. And that's gone up to, I think, 730 billion now. So there is an increase BE over BE. Now, there was a need for the government to increase the allocations for NREGA during the year, and therefore the 615 billion became initially 1,000 billion, and then went up to 1,100 billion or so. Now, that was a relief program which was given a lot of money in the May, June, July period when the crisis was very severe and the government did the right thing of saying, let's put in a lot more money than that was budgeted for Narega, and they almost doubled it. But now, instead of saying that this worked and we should do more before we see the private sector investment coming up, the infrastructure that we are building kicks off and creates employment over there, it would have probably been a lot more wiser to keep the investments on Narega going and keeping it higher than what we actually saw in the BE last year till infrastructure kicks in. That connection seems to be missing.
So you're saying a very important thing. The time to cut in Rega is not now. It might come later when private sector investment has kicked in. But if you cut in Rega before private sector investment kicks in and starts creating its own jobs, then the people who are dependent on Nrega will suddenly find they have no succor and no relief, and they will be back facing the crisis of unemployment that you dug them out of. In other words, whatever good you've done by increasing Nrega last year, you're undermining or reversing by slashing the allocation this year.
Yes, I think it can bring in some distress. It can cause some avoidable distress. The money isn't too much. I mean, since we spent a much higher number than we had targeted for last time, and the problem of employment hasn't gone away, I think putting in a little more money would have gone a long way in creating that buffer in rural India to ensure that people are not too distressed. I think it would have been much better to do that.
Particularly at a time when farmers are protesting and farmer anger is growing, this could only add further fuel to it. So in addition to being economically unwise, it's also politically unwise. Now, in that Business Standard article, you make one further point. You say, and I'm quoting you, hopes of an urban version of Nrega were belied. So let me ask you, do you believe an urban Nrega is necessary and was required? And secondly, if the answer to the first is yes, has the finance minister made a mistake disregarding it?
Well, I say this in a larger perspective or a certain sense that I have on what the government should be doing. Manrega has been very successful in providing relief for lack of employment opportunities in rural India. It has been very effective in a time of crisis like we had in 1920. In 2021, it was the only scheme available that could immediately go out and help out distressed farmers, distressed rural India. Now, we should learn from this is the point I want to make, is that government schemes can provide relief. And in times of distress, it's good to have them over there. But more importantly, there are lots of government services. So in urban India, it's a different story. There are lots of government services which are woefully short compared to what they should be. We have very low presence of government on security. The number of policemen compared to the population is extremely low. The number of government service giving us good services, whether in health or in education or in sanitation.
But are you coming around to saying that there was a need for urban Nrega and that in disregarding that need, she's made a mistake?
So, I mean, disregarding what? I cannot say that the finance minister was given an offer that she rejected. That would be equal to saying disregarding. So there are economists who have said that there should be an urban Narega.
What's your answer? Do you believe there should be an urban Nrega?
I think there should be an urban Narega.
So in other words, by not creating one, she's erred.
Well, this was something that could have been done and has not been done. And I would say it would be much better if she had done it.
Okay. And in not doing it, the problem of urban unemployment that continues has not got any measure of relief which she could have given it. That follows, doesn't it?
That's right.
Now, in your Business Standard article, you also make a very important point about central government employment. First of all, you point out that for the last 3 years, the government keeps revising the figure, which clearly means we don't know what is the truth. And secondly, you point out that the figure for central government employment in 2021 ends up being lower than the original figure the government cited for 70 for 1819. So I want to ask you a simple question. How is it that the central government doesn't have a clear and precise idea of the number of people it employs? It's the boss, it's employing them. How come it doesn't have a clear idea of how many it's employing?
So, two things before I get down to the answer is this question should be addressed to the government. I do not know why they can't get their numbers right. But the second point I also want to make in this is that this is not the only government that doesn't get it right. All budgets in the past, without exception, get it wrong. So every time they say that they have got a certain number of people employed and this number is going to go up to X, and next year it goes down, and 2 years later it goes down even more. As a result, if you look at the time series of people employed by the central government, it's rock steady at 3.2 to 3.3 million. It doesn't move that from there at all. 3.2 to 3.3 million steady for 15 years. That means the central government, of course, in 15 years, people have retired from central government. On a net basis, central government is not adding employment. And this, now let's come to the last point that you're making, the point that you're making. The government doesn't know. And it looks like the government doesn't know or doesn't seem to know. And therefore, what is the reliability of administrative data?
Absolutely.
Administrative data, this they should have known. The EPFO data, which is also administrative, is also extremely volatile. Lots of variations in that. The Manrega employment is extremely volatile. So I think administrative data, that the kind of hope that Panagaria report had placed on and the government placed a lot on, is actually misplaced.
Let me extrapolate out of this. If the central government doesn't know how many people it is itself employing, and clearly your Business Standard article shows that, because each year for the last 3 years, they keep repeatedly revising their figures forwards, backwards, and then they end up with the strange situation where the figure for 2021 is actually lower than the figure for 1890. If that is the case with regard to central government employees, then that also suggests they don't have a clear idea of employment nationwide. They don't have a clear idea of how many urban people have lost their jobs. They don't have a clear idea of how many rural people are in need of NREGA. In other words, our data with regard to employment is not accurate. In fact, in some places, it's probably pretty hopeless. It's a guesstimate.
Yes, I think it is possible to clean up the administrative data fairly easily. It's a matter of getting your systems right. If the government can put its head together, whether it is EPFO data, ESIC data, or data regarding employment in government, state government, central government, and the rest of it all, it can get it right very easily, very quickly. There used to be a publication which used to give employment in the public sector, including all the way till the PSUs, and that's discontinued.
In other words, the government has the capacity to get good, accurate data. It can if it wants, but it chooses not to, which also suggests it's not a priority for the government. This is another reflection of the attitude of the Economic Survey to Employment. This is another reflection of the attitude of the finance minister in her budget speech to employment. It wasn't an issue of priority. It didn't get mentioned in the survey or sufficient mention in the budget speech. It also reflects in the fact that the government isn't doing anything like enough to correct its data of employment, because it could if it wanted to, but it hasn't. Very quickly, let me now raise two longer-term historic issues to do with employment very quickly with you. The first is to do with female labor force participation. Now, even government's own official statistics show that between 2011-12 and 2017-18, female labor force participation fell by 8% to 23%. Your organization, CMIE, says it's even lower at 11%. But in comparison, the figure for Bangladesh is 30%, for Indonesia it's 39%, for Thailand it's 45%. Why are we so much lower than comparable countries around us? And is the government taking credible steps to push up female labor force participation, or once again, is it failing to do so?
Well, first of all, it's Bangladesh 30% is really remarkable, very good. India has a low female labor force participation rate, a falling female labor force participation rate, which, in my opinion, is a lot more serious than what the government figures tell us. It boils down to the same problem, Karan, that if we do not acknowledge the extremely low participation rate of women, and if we do not acknowledge its continuous fall, we will not begin to find how to solve the problem. So I think the problem is the same that we said initially: lack of acknowledgement of the problem. If you don't acknowledge, you'll do nothing about it. Now, if you acknowledge, you will see that female labor force participation rate in urban India is worse than it is in rural India. Urban India has better jobs. Urban India has better educated women. How is it that better educated women in places where better jobs are available in the service sector still do not go into the labor force? The unemployment rate is very high for women. Two things. If you have a low labor participation rate combined with a very high unemployment rate, it means that society is skewed against hiring women. I don't blame government only. The government needs to take cognizance of this and has to take measures to repair it. But it also is a statement regarding society.
On
That
that issue, is the government taking effective steps to repair it?
I think it has taken one step, and it's arguable whether that's enough or not. For example, a few years ago, the government said that women need to be given a lot more maternity leave and need to provide facilities for young mothers. I think it is a good step, but in isolation, it works against women, because it does not do anything for the employers, who will then immediately say this is too expensive and we are not going to do it. I think it requires a lot more attention than just that.
So that is the nub of your answer. A lot more attention is required by the government beyond simply permitting women to take maternity leave. And once again, it raises the question, what is the use of Beti Bachao, Beti Badhao, if actually effective steps are not being taken to ensure that female labor force participation increases? One more question on the general employment situation. Yes, go ahead.
So, Karan, I think I just want to intervene over here. Beti Padhao, Beti Bachao is very good, whether you do employment or not. So if we make that step of educating women, it's a great step, and I appreciate that in a big way. I think we should do that.
But that's not enough. But there's a step beyond that must be taken, which is to ensure that women join the labor force in very large numbers. After all, if 30% of women in Bangladesh can be part of the labor force, if 39% in Indonesia, why is the figure in India as just as low as 23, or as your organization says, as low as 11? But there's a second problem with labor, and that is to do with the general labor force participation rate in India. Ours hovers around 40%. Globally, it's 66%, which means we are way behind the global standard. Why are we so far behind? And is this government taking steps to catch up?
Well, in this case, it's taking no steps to catch up, and it's not even recognizing this problem, that there is a serious problem in the labor force participation rate being very low. The government does not speak in terms of the demographic dividend that India can tap into, and it can tap into it only if the young population comes into the labor force and sees jobs. The reason why, I think the primary reason why the labor force participation rate in India is so low is India just doesn't offer jobs. So if India says that go and get self-employment, I think that's a very poor statement. You cannot say the economy cannot provide you jobs, the government cannot provide you jobs. Go and do your own stuff. What can a person do? So an educated person expects his education to pay off by finding jobs. I think the country is failing big time to generate sufficient jobs to deploy its young population and reap the dividends of this demography. I think that's a colossal loss for India. And this demographic dividend window shuts in about 15 years from now. So we're done.
In other words, you're also suggesting, although you haven't said it so explicitly, that the attitude that a man making pakoras is also doing a job is not going to get us to push up our LPF, the labor force participation rate, to 66%. We need to do a lot more to create jobs, to encourage people to get them, not suggest that a man making pakoras is actually gainfully employed.
Right.
I want to come right at the end of this interview to another issue you raised. It's not to do with employment. And this time it came in an article you wrote for the Economic Times, not the Business Standard, but it is to do with the budget. It's to do entirely with the claim made by the government that this year, government spending, government expenditure will be increasing by 28.4%. First of all, you point out that this includes a sum of 3 trillion, which is actually an allocation to write off past borrowing by the Food Corporation of India. And you say this increases government borrowing, but it does not increase spending in a sense that could spur demand. That's a very important clarification, which the government did not make.
Yeah, the government presented the accounts, and it did, in almost a passing way, talk about the 28% increase in government spending and the fiscal deficit going up to 9.5% of GDP, so on and so forth. When I look at the budget, I look at government spending as the most important indicator. And I try to get that number in a real sense as much as I can. And even after the budget is presented, month after month, the CGA puts out those numbers, and we watch it very carefully to see if the government spending enough or not. Because if the government doesn't spend enough, we cannot come out of this huge slowdown or decline that we have seen in the economy. The only way out is the government needs to spend. And when I see a 28% increase, I jump out of my seat and I say, wow, that's big. And then I say, I got to be careful because I know that in the first half, their expenditure grew 0%. Till December, the growth was 8%. How can you get 28% of the remaining part of the year? As simple, something has to be wrong over here. So we go digging and we find this FCI thing. And I say, even if I don't count that, even if you want to get 17%, you got to grow 51% of the remaining
But just a moment, you're collapsing a lot of what you've written in that article into one answer, and those who haven't read the article won't follow your logic. So let me take you step by step. The first thing you pointed out in the Economic Times article is that this claim that government spending has grown by 28.4% includes 3 trillion to write off borrowings by the Food Corporation of India. And this is spending that won't spur demand. It may add to the government's borrowing, but it's not going to spur demand. It's not going to boost the economy. Secondly, right. You say, if you exclude this 3 trillion from the total spending, then government spending comes down from its claim of 28.4% to just 17%. First of all, that's a lot less than the government claim. And it's certainly not, we have spent, as the finance minister boasted at the press conference after the budget. So the true spending that's actually going to boost the economy is not 28, it's 17. And that doesn't really justify the claim we have spent. Would you agree with that?
That's right. So you see, even in 1819, no, in 1920, central government expenditure grew by 16%. That wasn't a crisis year. 1920 was not a crisis year. Central government expenditure grew by 16%. In a crisis year, 17%. So this is not going to take us out of the mess that we are in right now. In 2008-9, when there was a crisis, central government expenditure grew by 24%. So if you look at the trend, in central government expenditure, 17% is like business as usual. And I borrow the phrase from Ratin Roy, who wrote that in another article somewhere. And if you look at the trend, this is really not an increase in central government spending. So this 17% is not enough.
Now, in fact, even that 17%, you write in your article for the Economic Times, can be seriously questioned, because you point out that during the first 3 quarters of this year, government spending only increased by 8%. So if we are going to increase by 17% over the year as a whole, that means that in the fourth quarter, government spending has to increase by almost 51%. Right. Is that realistic? Is it likely?
It's very, very difficult to believe that the government will be able to spend that money. What can happen is what I missed in my article, that they may adjust the losses to fertilizer subsidies as well, which are also outstanding. So it will be more a cleaning of the books and settling the accounts than actually spending. And the need of the hour is to spend. This is not the time to clean up your accounts. You can do that any other time.
That's another important point you're making, that if the government is going to achieve 51% spending in the fourth quarter, it's very likely this won't be spending that boosts the economy. It will be spending that pays off borrowing, particularly past borrowing for fertilizer. That will clean the books. But once again, just as writing off the food corporation's borrowings didn't boost the economy, nor will cleaning up fertilizer borrowings boost the economy. What we need is expenditure that boosts the economy. That looks unlikely. So we're coming to the end, and there's a very simple, straightforward, stark conclusion that stares us in the face. Government spending this year is not 28%, even though that's what the finance minister claims. It's much closer to 17, and it will only be 17, you say, if actually the money spent in the fourth quarter is used to write off fertilizer borrowings. It's not likely to be used to boost the economy. So the euphoria that the government is spending, and this spending will create demand, and this demand will boost production, and that in turn will lead to employment, that euphoria has been pretty effectively punctured by the fact that when you look at the details of the spending, a lot of it ends up being writing off borrowings from the food corporation, or now possibly from the fertilizer subsidy. Isn't that right?
That's right.
So we end on a very downbeat note. Just to sum up, in the first half of this interview, you said, we have, and I'm quoting you, a very serious employment problem on our hands. Secondly, don't take too much cheer from the fact that employment in January has gone up, and the actual extent of employment is only 9.8 million, because a lot of local factors could have actually intervened. The overall employment picture remains bad, and the problem is this has not been acknowledged almost at all in the economic survey, and only perhaps tangentially and indirectly in the budget itself. There's very little the budget does to actually create jobs. And when it comes to this claim about expenditure, well, as we've just shown, it's nowhere near 28%. Thank you very much for puncturing the hype that was created. The reality is, of course, more difficult to live with, but it is the truth. I thank you for this interview. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.